Good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Labbé, IPI's Senior Policy Analyst in charge of Humanitarian Affairs Program, and I am happy to welcome you to this discussion with Michael Keating, Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in the country. Mr. Keating will be mostly speaking today in his role as Humanitarian Coordinator, although he can hardly ignore his other important functions of DSRSG and Resident Coordinator. Indeed, today's event is the first of a new IPI series offering a platform to humanitarian coordinators and other senior humanitarian leaders to meet and exchange with the UN and diplomatic community in New York. This initiative, which is part of IPI's Humanitarian Affairs Program, aims to provide first-hand information to members of the UN community and to broader policy and academic circles on the reality of faraway humanitarian crises. It is also an opportunity to debate and reflect with some experienced practitioners on some of the greatest challenges to humanitarian action today, from the needed rapprochement between humanitarian action and development, to the inevitable difficulties of coordinating an ever-expanding humanitarian community, to the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations. Mr. Keating, whom we are very pleased to welcome here as our inaugural guest in this new series, will be followed on October 1st here in the Tocqueville Center by Mr. David Grisley, Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for the Sahel, for which invitations will be sent out shortly. We sincerely hope that you will enjoy this new series, and we are looking forward to receiving your feedback. Now, without any further delay, I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Maureen Quinn, IPI Senior Adviser, who will chair this discussion and further introduce our speaker. Maureen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeremy, and good afternoon, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure for us to have Michael Keating here with us and to start our humanitarian series. Today is September 11th, 2012, and 11 years after 9/11, Afghanistan and its international community have a renewed partnership. Following a year of major conferences in Bonn, Istanbul, Chicago, and Tokyo, signed agreements on strategic partnerships, mutual accountability, and regional cooperation provide a framework for the international community, a framework that's constructive, certainly, for cooperation. That said, Afghanistan has significant humanitarian needs that are still among the greatest in the world, a decade after intense and massive assistance. So, Michael, we look forward to your providing us insights on the current situation and giving us a perspective on the humanitarian challenges ahead of Afghanistan, particularly in light of the major upcoming challenges and changes, the 2014 presidential election and the drawdown of NATO's international security assistance forces. Questions include, given the needs and the ongoing conflict, what is the United Nations, what is the current strategy for you as the coordinator for the international humanitarian community in Afghanistan? What about the Afghans themselves? In a country so prone to natural disaster, drought, floods, avalanches, and earthquakes, combined with the ongoing conflict, what can you tell us about the Afghanistan's capacity to confront the volatile nature of the environment in which they live? Finally, how has the international partnership been strengthened in meeting Afghanistan's humanitarian needs? What do you see as the partnership's strengths and weaknesses? Welcome also to all of you, and thank you very much for joining in our discussion today. While you have Michael's bio on your handout, let me share some of the highlights of his background and his expertise that he brings to the discussion. Michael has extensive experience in planning and managing responses to complex humanitarian emergencies.
Sorry.
Okay. Let's hope they're not calling him back. good. He's still with us. Anyhow, he definitely has extensive experience. He's managed post-conflict recovery programs in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and Africa. He has field and headquarters experience in the United Nations system. He has worked in the private sector, in management consulting and strategic communications, and he has a depth of firsthand knowledge of Afghanistan, having lived and worked in Afghanistan and in Pakistan several times over the past 15 plus years. So thank you very much. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much. And it's great to see a number of familiar faces in the group today. It makes me slightly nervous because I suspect you know more about Afghanistan than I do. And thank you so much for this invitation, and a real privilege to be the first person to take part in this series. You've covered a number of very important points in your introductory remarks, and I would like just to echo some of those. But let me begin by, a strange feeling. I left Kabul on Tuesday, and since then I've been in Brussels, I've been in London, I've been in Copenhagen, I've been meeting colleagues from the NGO community, some in the UN, from donor nations, and from the media. And the mood about Afghanistan seems to be much more negative outside Afghanistan than it is when you're actually there. So I'm having to sort of double take slightly, and find myself having to sort of explain a few things about Afghanistan that may not be evident in the media reporting. I have to say, if you only hear about a country through reporting in the media, you can sometimes get a very negative impression of what's going on because it's not offset by the daily reality that people experience. But I don't want to exaggerate this. I mean, Afghans are facing a very uncertain and unpredictable future, and they are hedging their bets in terms of how to handle this future. They're facing, as you said, the reality of the departure of the international military, and they don't know what that is going to mean for them from a security perspective. They're facing the prospect of elections in 2014. These are absolutely fundamental to the legitimacy of the future government. They're also facing uncertainties over peace and reconciliation. And sometimes, initiatives on peace and reconciliation have a precisely the opposite than calming effect, with everyone assuming that they're being left out of something that's going on. The thing is, everybody feels left out, so I don't know who's involved, but there's a sense that things are happening from which people are excluded. But the point is that the Afghans do indeed face an uncertain and unpredictable future. And in some ways, I think the responsibility of the international community is to help Afghans reduce that level of uncertainty, reduce that level of unpredictability. And there's been a lot of extraordinary heavy lifting over the last years to do precisely that. You've mentioned it. Make sure that there is support for the Afghan National Security Forces. Make sure that there's support for an Afghan-led process of trying to build confidence around a number of specific issues in a very difficult and fractious neighborhood. It's one of the most difficult neighborhoods in the world, with neighbors who don't necessarily get on with each other at all. And also try and assure the Afghans that even at a time of global recession, even at a time when domestic politics in the countries which are traditionally most supportive of Afghanistan, and even when Syria and Yemen and the Sahel and other things are going on, that the international community remains with the Afghans, that they will not be abandoned again as they were in 89 to 92. I think, having been at the Tokyo conference, I was deeply impressed by the willingness of the international community to commit to standing by the Afghans. They pledged very large sums of money, which is not the same as committing the money, but pledged $4 billion a year to 2015 and a similar amount beyond that. But the message to the Afghans was, our ability politically to continue supporting Afghanistan does depend upon you as a government, but also working with civil society to move robustly forward in a number of areas, such as fighting corruption, improving accountability for human rights abuses, protecting the rights of women, planning elections which are as free, as fair as possible, and indeed strengthening the capacity of the state to absorb resources and deliver results with those resources. And I was particularly pleased with Tokyo, including the role of the UN, because it was the first of the conferences so far in the last year in which the people of Afghanistan were put back in the center of the equation. I mean, so often, we're focused on green on blue, we're focused on Haqqanis, we're focused on, all the drama and the horror, that we forget that actually it is the welfare of the people, it's the human development, it's the humanitarian situation which needs to be addressed if Afghanistan's future is to be both secure and prosperous and politically stable. Failure to address human development, failure to address the humanitarian needs will have very negative consequences for the entire project and for the ability of the government to persuade the people that it is able to respond to their needs. Now, the humanitarian situation is characterized by, I would say, the first thing to say about it is that many organizations, international organizations, have their biggest humanitarian operations in the world in Afghanistan, including some of the UN agencies, including, I believe, ICRC and others. This is, unfortunately, one of the biggest humanitarian caseloads in the world, and that often gets forgotten. And one of the discussions we're having, and maybe you can help me answer this, is why this does not really feature. Why is it that the humanitarian dimension to this to Afghanistan constantly gets sort of forgotten or airbrushed out of things? Is it because the humanitarians are not as good as they should be at communicating the situation? Is it because, as some of my colleagues say, it doesn't fit with the broader narrative of everything going really well and that drawing attention to large numbers of people in need doesn't quite work? Is it because maybe there are many other reasons, but the humanitarian situation is indeed very serious, and I would say broadly characterized by three things. First of all, those affected directly or indirectly by conflict. Very large numbers of internally displaced people, somewhere in the region of 400 to 600,000, probably 600,000, with a very large number generated this year, somewhere in the order of 130,000. If this was happening in any other country in the world, I suspect it would be on the front pages. No one's paying attention to it in Afghanistan. That does not mean that the number is going up by 130,000, because a lot of people are being returned to their communities. There are also a very large number of refugees, as you know, and those directly affected by ongoing fighting and conflict, including civilians caught up in the crossfire. The second large group are those affected by so-called natural disasters, which are increasingly less natural, whether they're earthquakes or avalanches or floods. And the year on year, the number of people continues to mount. This is partly a function of population growth, but it's also a function of things like land ownership and people living in areas which makes them more vulnerable, and partly because of the difficulties in responding to these problems. The third very large group, and it's the biggest group of the lot, are the chronically vulnerable. Last year, the international community, the humanitarian community, was providing support of one kind or another to about 7 or 8 million people, whether in the form of 1 million people receiving emergency water, very large numbers of people receiving food aid of one kind or another, emergency shelter, and so on. So this is a huge group of people. And I think, the challenge that we as a humanitarian community face is, number one, just being accurate and explaining this story, just mapping who is where, and how they are negatively affected. And one of the things that we're quite, that we've put a lot of energy into, and that there's a website if you're interested, is literally just mapping people. Where are they? What are their problems? We've mapped every earthquake in the last 30 years. We're mapping all the communities affected by floods. We're mapping the location of all the IDPs, the places from which they've gone, where they're going back to. And that mapping is often missing, or has been missing, in conversations about humanitarian need. The other thing we're doing, which is quite difficult, is to map capacities to respond. And the basic thinking is that if we have a stronger handle on where people in need are and what kind of needs they have, on the one hand, and we then have a handle on where the capacities to respond are, whether they're through the government, such as the Afghan National Disaster Management Agency, or through the Afghan Red Crescent Society, or through the UN system, or through the NGOs, then we can begin to have a really serious strategic discussion about, do we have the capacities in the right place, the right kind of capacities to respond to the needs that are both evident and that may be coming down the track. And in our view, that's the best basis also for looking at strengthening coordination, for strengthening the cluster system. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this whole issue about how you strengthen humanitarian clusters so that you can have more timely and effective responses, but also gives us a basis for telling the story. We are now in a much stronger position to tell the story. Some of the statistics I've been reeling off in the last 10 minutes, I don't think I would not have been as confident about them as a year ago as I am now. And now that we've got this information, we can start banging the drum. And you were asking what our strategy is. The strategy is not only to improve our ability to respond to humanitarian needs, but to challenge, on the basis of this information, some of the policies that are maybe resulting in the generation of people in humanitarian need, and certainly that are doing little to reduce the humanitarian caseload. For example, 8 out of the last 12 years, we've had a massive emergency water tankering program. Well, what does that say about development interventions? What does that say about our disaster risk reduction work? What does that say about what we're doing for resilience? Are we spending our money on the right things when it comes to development? Are we really tackling that famous development deficit between long-term development characterized by things like, building health systems and infrastructure and education systems, and people in need of emergency support? With the facts and with the data, we can do that. We can also have a much stronger basis for challenging colleagues on the military side of things. Are they doing enough to protect civilians? Are they doing enough to make sure that the orders that go to local commanders are sufficiently clear on these issues? And there, I think we've seen some very positive progress, particularly with NATO ISAF. One of the concerns we have is that progress is then, as it were, transferred to the Afghan national security forces as they assume greater responsibility. But one of the things this is highlighting, by the way, and if you look at Afghanistan through the prism of the civilian population rather than blue on black and Haqqanis, then you begin to start questioning, well, is our interpretation of security too militarized? I mean, frankly, for most Afghans, even though protection from anti-government elements is clearly fundamentally important, the biggest security problem they've got is if somebody steals your land or steals or rapes your sister or something, who do you go to? You can't go to if somebody stole something from you, you wouldn't go to the army or the Marines, you would go to a policeman or a policewoman, one would hope. And this whole dimension of security in terms of helping the civilian population by providing a capacity to which they can resort needs to have a greater emphasis. So I won't. I can talk for hours. I won't go on for much longer. Just a few other points, because perhaps it'll be more useful if we have a question and answer session. But my view is, and I think this is shared by many of the colleagues, is that we do need to have a medium-term perspective on Afghanistan. If we are panicked by things that happen tomorrow, next week, next month, then we're going to live in a constant state of panic. But if we step back and say, what is it that we as an international community can do with our Afghan partners from civil society and in government to ensure that some of the anxieties and needs of the Afghans are met and pace ourselves accordingly, then I think we have a much better chance of finding lasting solutions to some of the problems that the Afghan population is facing. Having said that, that medium-term approach is going to be severely challenged in the next 1 or 2 years. Why? Because we do have the reality of the withdrawal of the international military, and that is going to create dynamics, and we're not quite sure what those dynamics are going to be. But we can anticipate some of them. There will be dynamics both in terms of security, and as I say, I think protection of civilians and ensuring a civilian police force is one issue there. There are going to be dynamics in terms of jobs and livelihoods. An awful lot of people are employed as a result of the presence of the international military. Some of the revenues of the state are dependent upon the presence of the military in the form of imports and exports. What will the loss of these livelihoods mean? What policy response does that require? Should we as an international community be giving as much emphasis to livelihoods and jobs as maybe we're giving to airports and hospitals? You know, in terms of governance, there are also going to be dynamics. I think the international military, which, by the way, doesn't recognize it, but is actually the biggest development and governance actor in Afghanistan by far, you know, their departure is going to reduce the ability of provincial governors and district governors and administrations to function. Are we ready as an international community, as a UN, to step in and try and support the Afghans maintain those capacity? And what will the humanitarian consequences be? And I think here we have to be quite careful. On the one hand, we need to be prepared for things that could go wrong. On the other hand, not be yelling from the rooftops that doom is nigh and we're all about to fall off the edge of a cliff, because I don't think that is the case. I think if we have time, if we are prepared, if we think about the kind of policy interventions that are required, then there really is time to work with our Afghan partners to make sure that as much as is possible is done in the next 2-3 years to anticipate the departure of the international military and to help the Afghans make sure that they take advantage of some of the very real offers, which are politically vulnerable, but nevertheless very real offers made in Chicago, made in Tokyo, to stand by the Afghans, not to abandon them. So we mustn't lose our nerve. We must be prepared, but not cry wolf. So let me stop at that point. I probably haven't answered all your questions, but I look forward to doing so on the basis of points from the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And I'm going to have one more question from me before I open it up to the floor. You know, in the questions of for the humanitarian community, one of the big issues it's always talked about is humanitarian access. And certainly you're the coordinator for the United Nations.
That's the biggest one. That's why I forgot it. Damn, I thought, hoping you weren't going to raise it. But anyway, yeah.
So why don't you start out? Give us your perspective on access, and then I'll open it up to the floor.
First of all, I think there is a correlation between humanitarian need, security, and access. I'm not sure we know exactly what the correlation is, but I suspect, and we're working on the evidence, that many humanitarian needs are greatest in the areas where there is greatest insecurity and where there is least humanitarian access. But we shouldn't be bland about this. I think we have to be quite precise. For example, we're now mapping through WHO, UNICEF, and others where polio might be the biggest problem. And the early evidence suggests that the connection between polio and conflict and access is very, very high indeed. Does that apply to malnutrition? We're not sure. You may have heard that there has been a recent government report, the Multi-Indicator Cluster Survey, which is supported by UNICEF, which shows that some parts of Afghanistan, and surprisingly, parts of Afghanistan which have received the biggest dollops of development assistance, have the highest levels of malnutrition. Kandahar is one example. I was down there a week ago, talking to nutritionists in hospitals, and even talking to a salt manufacturer who sees a market opportunity in malnutrition. Afghans are very enterprising, by the way. But are we mapping the incidence of malnutrition against access? Is there a correlation there? Similarly, ability to reach internally displaced people and people living in informal settlements. There, it may not be such an issue. Actually, one of the shocking things about the internally displaced is how many of them are living adjacent, smack in the middle of cities like Kandahar and Kabul and Mazar, where there are no problems of access at all. The point is that there are correlations. We need to understand them more carefully. The other thing we need to understand better is how to achieve access. And there's quite a lot going on this front. The non-governmental community is in the process of sharing very practical information about who is working where, how they are reaching communities in need. And we have been invited as the UN to participate in those discussions and benefit from them. And we are doing exactly the same thing as the UN family, inviting the NGOs to be involved. And looking at where we are actually able to reach access, to reach communities, and where communities are able to reach services. The thing here is there are no easy solutions. Access for a polio campaign is very different to access to get a water truck through. The kind of relationships you need, the kind of security arrangements you need are very different. What works in one part of the country doesn't necessarily work in another part of the country. And the strategies being adopted, whether by UN agencies or NGOs, are very different. In the discussion we had with the NGOs, one of them was saying, our approach is to make sure that our branding is very clear, everybody knows we're coming, there's no secrets. Chap sitting next to him said, we do precisely the opposite. We get rid of our cell phones, we take away our ID, we have absolutely no branding, we use public transport. So access is quite a tricky field. But I think the point is that at the very practical level, the key issue is to gain the confidence of communities. NGOs tend to be very good at that, to share experience, not to adopt a cookie-cutter approach, and to back up practical field level attempts to achieve access, with making sure that any political discussions to do with peace and reconciliation take into account the need, the humanitarian imperative, and the need to make sure that parties recognize that they have a responsibility, and in fact there are even benefits to them, of trying to facilitate access. So I don't know if that answers your questions. It's a tricky area and there are no easy solutions.
No, thank you very much. I think really giving that kind of breadth is a good opening, and certainly important for us here as we start this discussion as part of our humanitarian series. So now the floor is open. I ask that you please introduce yourself and who you're with, and then we are webcasting live, so we always remind everyone, please hold the microphone steady. So the floor is open to questions. Okay. We'll start over here. Thank you.
Dirk Solomons, Columbia University. You mentioned several times the opportunity of working with Afghan partners. And I wonder whether you could describe, what are the strongest elements that you see as potential partners? What in Afghan society, in their governance structures, are the most promising components where you see a strong future even when the international community has to withdraw?
I think we had one over here. We'll take two. Thanks. Yes,
Warren Hogue, IPI. Mr. Keating, in parts of the country where there is conflict, where you have international forces at work, is there a coordination between them and you humanitarians, or are you working at cross purposes?
Shall I attempt to answer those? Thank you for your question. Undoubtedly, the most important Afghan partner is local communities, by far. They are the biggest humanitarian actors. They have the most capacity. When things happen to Afghan individuals or families, the first people they turn to are their neighbors. And actually, one of the most remarkable things I think about Afghanistan is not so much what has gone wrong as what has actually continued to go right. And one of the things has been the resilience of community structures. Having said that, we're concerned that Afghan resilience is eroding. The coping capacities, particularly in remote and vulnerable areas, is decreasing. Other than Afghan communities themselves, very important partners include local governors and local government structures. I was up in Saripul recently, the day after a flood, delighted to discover that the governor was absolutely, totally focused on this. He'd mobilized all the line ministries, the police, the army, the NGOs, was having a big discussion about who was going to do what. Having a governor who is motivated to respond to humanitarian crises can make an enormous difference. There are other entities with humanitarian roles in their mandates. I mentioned ANZMA, the Disaster Management Agency, but there are also ministries with responsibilities such as rural development, agriculture, livestock, refugees and returnees. Some of them have more capacity than others. Some of them, unfortunately, are in fact very, very weak. And I do think one of the challenges that we have not surmounted is a more systematic approach to strengthening the capacity of our Afghan partners, whether at the national level or at the local level, to take on roles which would allow them to be more prominent in both preventing and responding to humanitarian crises. In terms of conflict areas, we do have a very healthy relationship as a humanitarian community, respectful, I would say, not friction-free with the military, both the Afghan and the international military. One of the things that we've started is a series of discussions with both the Afghan National Security Forces and ISAF on protection of civilians. We're engaged in discussions with them on things like the Afghan local police, which our military colleagues see as fundamental to the future of security of Afghanistan, whereas people on the humanitarian side are very worried that just because they work in one place doesn't mean they're necessarily going to work everywhere, and that protection of civilians isn't necessarily hardwired into their training, into their operations, into the way they deploy. We're also discussing with them on the basis of a memorandum of understanding the respective roles of humanitarian actors and military actors in response to urgent crises. And there is an understanding that they are in extremis, they are last resort, the use of their logistics and so on. Clearly, there are quite robust discussions going on around the UN's reports on human rights abuse, on protection of civilians, to the degree that responsibility is being laid at the door of the military. Here, we're always very careful to point out that the biggest problem is the anti-government elements. The data shows that actually most of the problem when it comes to protection of civilians is not coming from the Afghan and international military. It's more coming from the insurgent side. We're even getting advisories from the military about operations they're undertaking so that the humanitarian community can be more prepared when it comes to conflict, possible conflict-affected populations. So, it's a healthy relationship. Coordination, I mean, it's not as if we sit around, planning who's going to do what in response to a crisis. I think it's more trying to make sure that the respective roles and responsibilities are well understood on all sides, and that there are open channels of communication so that when urgent action is required, we know who needs to do what, and at least what the discussion should be about.
Roma Stibrovi, NGO Sustainability. I am wondering how you bring sustainability elements into your humanitarian work in terms of, for example, solar cookers, improved cook stoves, LED solar lighting. Are you trying to integrate sustainability with humanitarian work? Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Jeff Laurenti with the Century Foundation. Mr. Keating, to what extent do your Afghan partners include people in either the local or Kabul political class that are known to be sympathizers of, or with some channels to, the insurgencies, and do they serve as a conduit for being able to do humanitarian work in areas that may be militarily contested? And thinking further, that political class in Kabul, to what extent does Parliament, does the President, do the ministries view humanitarian issues as a real priority when so-called real power seems to reside with the foreign military or the insurgents, and maybe increasingly the Afghan military? For them, is the development and humanitarian side the priority, or is the security and getting their own families taken care of in the event of a crisis really the first concern?
Come back to you.
Okay. Quickly, on the sustainability question, madam, the answer is we're not doing enough, frankly. What? None of us. So we should be doing much more, and I'd be very happy for your suggestions as to how we could do this. But this does speak to another issue, which is, and I forgot to mention this, those of you who are, theologians in the way that humanitarians work might be interested in knowing that we're moving from a CAP to a CHAP, which is remind me what a CHAP is. It's a Consolidated Humanitarian Action Plan. And one of the issues that we need to address in doing this is, part of our strategy will definitely be to draw attention to issues of resilience, issues of disaster risk reduction. But in the CAP we had this year, we stripped all that stuff out, partly because some of the donors said to us, if you don't, your CAP will lack credibility. So we stripped it all out. I got a lot of grief from the UN agencies and the NGOs for stripping it out. But I said, don't worry, the proof will be in the pudding. The money will come in because it's going to be lean and mean. Has the money come in? No. So we stripped it out. The money still didn't come in. So now we're revisiting this and trying to figure out, how do we come up with a CHAP that is strategic, and what do we do about resilience and DRR and stuff like that? Do we keep it out? Do we put it in? And this, in a way, leads bizarrely to your question, because your question was, part of it was, are humanitarian issues the priority for the Afghans? Well, they're not for the international community, so let alone for the Afghans. So, that's part of the reason that I'm on this trip, is to draw attention to the humanitarian needs. So I think it would be, you can fault the Afghans for not making humanitarian issues their priority, but maybe we should look at ourselves first in terms of the level of funding, in terms of the policy energy we're doing. I think Afghan politicians are probably like American politicians or politicians from any other part of the world. Their focus is on politics, on elections, and indeed on security, on what the changing environment will do for them, for their political groupings, for their tribe, for whatever it is. I have to say, some are focused on jobs and livelihoods and economic opportunity, but not as many as we would like. The vice president, one of the vice presidents, does have formal responsibility for humanitarian issues. He takes them very seriously. We've had discussions with them, but I must say that in those discussions, he tends to focus more on the natural disasters and the chronically vulnerable than on the populations affected by conflict. And as I say, this may not be dissimilar to others in the international community. In terms of, interlocutors, I think I mentioned before, to the degree that there are a few lessons about how to achieve humanitarian access, I think the most important is to work with local communities and with whoever they respect or they need in order to get things done. And from a humanitarian perspective, if that means that they are dealing with Taliban or other non-governmental or even anti-governmental actors, if that is required in order to get things done, then from a humanitarian perspective, that is, it is necessary and not objectionable. But that should not necessarily slip into some kind of political recognition of them, and it doesn't necessarily. It's working through the local communities.
Okay, so I know Anne had questions here.
Yes. My name is Ann Phillips. I'm a member of the board of IPI. I served on the board of Save the Children for many, many, many years. And we were the ones really who, we stopped the concept of giving assistance to the concept of true community development. We went into communities where there was great need, such as Afghanistan, that kind of dire need that communities have. And we helped them create a committee to determine what their primary needs were, the most severe needs were. So they really were participating in this. And then we sent in experts to help them fulfill their needs. So in the process, they were fulfilling their needs and learning how to deal with these problems themselves, which was the community development. So in terms of sustainability, which one of the women spoke about, it was enormously helpful. Now you speak about the governors and the politicians. Well, the governor's not going to be there forever. I mean, There'll be new governors, there'll be new politicians. So the communities really have to learn how to help themselves. And I'm sure you're fully aware of that.
I can only concur. I concur. Community capacities, community resilience. And that's why I think I do think the role of NGOs and the importance of NGOs will increase in the coming years. They've always been there. Some of them have been there 30 years. Their knowledge of the country, the relationships they have, they do feel quite sore at the moment, many of the NGOs, because they feel that they've been sort of marginalized in recent years. But I suspect their value, both to ministries that are trying to deliver services and to local communities, will resurface. Not that it's gone away, but it will become more evident, and I hope will be a bigger part of the mix as we move forward.
Question here. Thank you.
Only if there's nobody else. Udo Jans from UNHCR here in New York. Congratulations to the IPI and to Michael for kicking us off on the new Humanitarian Affairs program. I wanted to concur, for one, with your assessment that local communities is your best bet if you want to deliver humanitarian assistance. I think that is our experience too. Secondly, if I had to venture a guess why Afghanistan is not so much on the radar screen, I would venture Libya and Syria as having taken over every space that there is, save for perhaps when another boat sinks on the way to Australia or on the way to Lampedusa, when you suddenly hear that among those who were reported dead were also Afghans, and you begin to wonder. It is, unfortunately, only in the security context that we hear about Afghanistan and very little else at the moment. I wanted to perhaps ask you, Michael, to venture into another area that comes up in conversations all the time, and that is your double or triple-hatted function. Quadruple
Yeah.
hatted function and the tensions between them, if there is any, and how you overcome in your daily work, what perhaps is the gap between the end of relief and the beginning of development. If we look at the refugee situation with close to 6 million people that have returned to Afghanistan over the last decade, unless we deliver humanitarian assistance to them and beyond development assistance to them, I think it's obvious that they will be easy prey for the Taliban or others who will welcome them in their arms unless, of course, they somehow or other feel welcome in the places where they are, or they're enabled to return home, rebuild their homes, and get the livelihood that you spoke of earlier. How do you go about this? Is there a possibility to actually carve out a niche in Tokyo, in the donors conference, for humanitarian assistance to continue in parallel, side by side, in a continuum, so that development assistance will ultimately bite? Or are we still really turning around in circles? Thank you, Michael.
Well, that's a mischievous question from Udo, because if anyone can answer the question, he probably can, but I'll give it a shot. Look, the first thing to acknowledge is the creative tension that is generated by having the integrated mission approach, the triple or quadruple hatting. And I acknowledge that, and having spent much of my career working in the humanitarian community, I'm also very conscious of the importance of preserving space for humanitarian actors and the need to preserve impartiality, neutrality, and so on. The reality is that in all its wisdom, the UN has come up with the integrated mission model. I'm one of, I think, 12 people in the world who has this responsibility. And I see my job as making it work and identifying opportunities that that can make it work. And I think we were discussing this just beforehand. Before going there, I mean, the alternative to an integrated mission is possibly a disintegrated mission. It's like Churchill and democracy. I mean, democracy is a truly terrible form of government, except for all the other ones. And I just think that integrated missions may be a truly terrible way of organizing ourselves, except for all the alternatives, because I'm not sure what the alternative is. Because if we were pursuing political objectives, development objectives, humanitarian objectives, human rights objectives, security objectives, and did not have some place where these are coming together in a principled manner, which doesn't create mashed potatoes, but does, a neater, as it were, plate of issues in which you can see how they relate to each other, I think that is the issue. And some of the opportunities, seem to me, for example, to draw attention to human development and to humanitarian issues in fora that otherwise might not, you might not be able to, including, for example, in discussions with the military, in discussions with, political leaders. And, one thing clearly we are not doing enough, but we're going to do much more of, is precisely the area that you are talking about. Durable solutions rather than endless humanitarian responses. How do we get durable solutions? Well, you cannot do that by just having a conversation among the humanitarians. You've got to lift it out of that forum and have that conversation, in capitals with the people who are taking the decisions on development funding, and indeed decisions on security and security capacity. And it seems to me, I'm clearly not doing my job as well as I should be doing it, because this still is a bit of an orphan issue. But, this is one of the things that we must focus much more on. I have to say that, the last 5 years in Afghanistan, having a serious and sustained discussion about these kind of things has not been easy, because international attention, as you alluded to, is focused on security. Security, it's focused on, what's happening in electoral, shenanigans and so on. And every so often we do get a group of very important and empowered individuals together, at the top of the policy-making tree, and their tolerance to discuss resilience and disaster risk reduction. When yesterday a minister was removed and, a troop was killed and something else happened in Pakistan and something's going, it's quite difficult getting these issues the attention they deserve, but that's something that we absolutely must do. Part of it is coming up with powerful intellectual pieces on how we can do this. Part of it is ensuring that the programming options are there. Part of it is getting the money behind it. But ultimately, it's getting political attention to the importance of addressing this gap if the broader project is to go as well as we all hope. I mean, failure to address these things shouldn't be just done on humanitarian grounds. It's because otherwise the broader project is imperiled. If people do not feel that they have basic security in terms of jobs, basic security in terms of access to services, basic security in terms of access to justice, then things are going to go wrong politically. So that's why it's important.
Okay, so we have a question in the back and then up here in the front.
Hi, Michael. Christina Shigoya, DPKO. How are you?
Hi.
Hi. I wonder if you could say a few words, Michael, about the current situation of women in Afghanistan, particularly as it regards humanitarian access and also human development, and whether or not you think that this is negatively affected by the preponderance of men, whether you think it's negatively affected by the preponderance of men, both in leadership positions in Afghan society and also within the international community. Thank you.
Should I answer that or another one?
So yeah, we'll take Jeremy's too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this really brilliant presentation. I'd like to build on the question raised by Udo from UNHCR on your triple or quadruple hat. To what extent has it been a limitation in your ability to reach out to non-state armed groups in Afghanistan, being the Taliban, maybe some Al-Qaeda or Haqqani elements in some places, given that engagement with those non-state armed groups is key for humanitarian access, to engage them on protection of civilian issues, and to what extent the whole context of the now defunct global war on terror has impacted on your ability to reach out to these groups and dialogue with them on humanitarian issues. Thanks.
Okay, in terms of Christina's question, the reality in Afghanistan is it's a very, very conservative society indeed. Men and women, with a few exceptions, are not seen together in public. You do not see male Afghan politicians with their wives. It's very, very rare. I think the issue, basically the condition of women from an economic, social, human rights perspective is very bad. It's very bad. I think the way in which to try and support the women of Afghanistan is, first of all, by listening to them and what it is that they feel is going to be most important in helping them deal with the problems they face. There are some good bits of news, and I feel I haven't actually mentioned some of the good things that are happening on the humanitarian front, let alone the human rights front. There are a very large number of female politicians in Afghanistan. I suspect there are more Afghan MPs as a percentage than there are senators or Congress people. There's only one Afghan female governor, but at the parliamentary level, women are very active and very visible. There are economically, women do an awful lot of the work, especially in the rural areas, but don't get much of the, as it were, the remuneration or the benefit from that. But there needs to be much, much more done to create economic opportunities for women. Much more can be done on the social front as well. But it's extremely important to work with them in ways that they feel will help them. And that often means working with their husbands, with the ulema, with other networks which may not be, women only. To the degree that it's possible to mobilize women, that needs to be done to the degree that they are comfortable about that, particularly in rural areas. I have to say there is a big distinction between rural and urban women. Afghanistan has a long tradition of educated, brave, gutsy, urban women, and they are in a very, very different place from vast numbers of women living behind high walls, invisible in rural areas, and ways in which to help urban women cannot be applied to, or cannot be necessarily adopted with in rural areas. In fact, that's exactly what the communists tried to do in the 1970s with truly disastrous consequences. The other way round doesn't work either. The Taliban tried to apply the standards that they expect of women in rural areas and then tried to apply them in urban areas, and that got the whole world up in arms, quite rightly. So this is a complicated area. I think from a legal point of view, the issue is to try and increase understanding of women's rights, systems of accountability, strengthen a police force that has women in it and is responsive to women. That's a tough one. So there are a number of very practical things that can be done. But what can't be done is to turn, Afghanistan into Switzerland overnight. This is going to take a very long time, and the key thing is to work with Afghan women and to encourage them to organize and communicate with each other in ways that they are comfortable. Another tough question on what was it on now that the global war of terror is over. I'm glad it is. That's great. The quadruple hat being a limitation on reaching out. I can't think of. I can't. I mean, I'm trying to be really honest with myself. I cannot think of an instance when someone has said to me, apart from one NGO, fun enough, but certainly no Afghan has ever said to me, I can't talk to you because you've got this political, flavor to your humanitarian responsibilities. If anything, it's the other way around. I think knowing that you are, part of the political mission, I think probably makes you more attractive as an interlocutor to those who are trying to increase humanitarian access, because the hope is that you will be able to punch through at a political level, if they trust you enough, on humanitarian issues. One of the things that I should mention in my deputy SRSG capacity is that what UNAMA has done over the last year under the previous and now with vigor under this SRSG is to make it clear what the core objectives of the political mission are. And they are, number one, to support and promote a peace and reconciliation process among Afghans locally and to the degree that the international community wants to use the UN internationally. Two is to protect and promote human rights. And the third is to encourage coherent approaches by all actors, governmental, non-governmental, civil society, Afghan military, international military, towards governance and development. And it seems to me that these three very political objectives are not objectionable to the humanitarian community and are possibly very supportive of the work of the humanitarian community. The SRSG also feels very strongly that one of the responsibilities of the political mission is to create space for humanitarian actors. Now, I know this is quite scary stuff for those of you who may feel that, the political bits of the UN should stay a million miles away from the humanitarian bits of the UN. But as I say, while we have integrated missions, it seems to me this is quite a sensible and responsible approach to adopt. One last thought on this is that, there is research going on about perceptions among Afghans, including in Taliban areas or areas not controlled by the government, perceptions of the UN, of humanitarian actors, of NGOs. And the findings, do not lead one to the conclusion that they make massive distinctions between all these various actors. Frankly, you've got to have a very high level of knowledge of international organizations to be able to distinguish between international actors. I mean, I think they do distinguish between military and non-military, but in terms of non-military, most of us are a bit of a blur, and I think, as I was saying before, the most important thing is principled relationships that allow us to respond to need and not to get overhung up on distinctions between blue and black, as important as they may be. I haven't answered your global war on terror question. I'm not quite sure how I would, but somebody else may want to give it a shot. Yeah.
Thank you, Åsa Gustafsson, the Swedish UN mission in New York. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask if you could, or it would be interesting to hear if you could say a few words on corruption. It seems from some reports and/or surveys that in some places, some Afghans, at least some Afghans, would say that this is even a worse problem to them than the so-called insurgents, and it's everywhere in the ministries at local level and so on. So what would be your strategy on corruption? Thank you.
Oh, I've never been asked for my strategy on corruption. Let me think. Let me just make a few observations on this. One of the things that we did was support something called the People's Dialogue about a year ago, in which through about a dozen Afghan NGOs, 1,500 Afghans, including 500 women, were invited to come together in relatively small groups around the country to talk about what they thought were the biggest challenges facing Afghanistan, in particular with regard to getting a peace process going, peace and reconciliation. And the interesting thing is that the biggest obstacle they see, and I don't know if they're representative of all Afghans, but it's a pretty good shot at trying to get a representative view. The biggest problem they see, including the women, is corruption. Corruption is the thing that's stopping a peace process. Corruption is the thing that is giving oxygen to the anti-government elements. Corruption is the thing that undermines their confidence in government. Corruption is the thing that makes their daily lives miserable and reduces their security. So it is a very, very big problem. What to do about it? I mean, the good news is that you may know that about 6 weeks ago, after Tokyo, possibly prompted in part by the very strong messages from the international community about a fight on corruption being a sine qua non, for the international community to honor its pledges. The president issued a very comprehensive decree on fighting corruption. This is consistent with him saying that he wants his legacy, to be, Now, some people sniggered at this. Some people doubt that it will, it'll be implemented. It's too ambitious. The timeline is too short, and so on. But it's good that, at the top, at least the political instinct is to recognize the problem and to try and trigger some kind of reaction to it. One thing that the Afghans do point out, and I'm not just talking about the politicians, even ordinary Afghans, is that while corruption, may be an Afghan phenomenon, it certainly isn't only confined to the Afghans. And what you've seen over the last 10 years is a truly gargantuan amount of money flooding into Afghanistan. And that this has turbocharged, indigenous corruption. And therefore, it is very important, as people like John Allen have recognized, that to the degree that the international community, quite rightly, is going to get tough on corruption and demand, real action by the Afghans, whether it's in terms of appointments, whether it's in terms of fiduciary responsibility, whether it's in terms of public financial management, whether it's in terms of doing something about the Kabul bank, that at the same time, we do need to look at the way the international community's engagement has contributed to the dynamics of corruption, and the degree to which our own organizations, including the UN, are doing everything possible to minimize corruption. And actually, this speaks to one other quick point, is one of the things that I think we're learning is that trying to get things done in a country as complicated as Afghanistan, with all the problems it involves, does involve risk. Risk by everyone, including by donors, risk by people who want to get around the country. And we need to get much better at identifying that risk, managing that risk, mitigating that risk, but sharing the risk as well. And that if the international community is going to ask the Afghan government or ask the UN or ask the World Bank or ask an NGO to do something, there has to be, as part of any contractual arrangement, explicit recognition of risk, particularly if national systems are going to be used, if the national budget is going to be used, which is developmentally correct. Let's recognize the risk and let's share that risk rather than be appalled when some piece of corruption is revealed, as if this is a shock horror and totally unexpected. We know that there is corruption. We know there is risk. Let's get more serious about how we work together to manage it and mitigate it.
Any other questions? Okay, yes, over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Seiichiro Taguchi from Mission of Japan. You have already made indications in the previous answers, but I want to have some more clarity. In the classical discussion on pros and cons of cooperation between humanitarian actors and military capability, I understand Afghanistan has been long front line of this discussion, and especially in view of securing humanitarian access. How do you assess the latest situation, especially how do you see the role of the PRT, Provisional Reconstruction Team, in order to secure the humanitarian access? Thank you very much.
The role of the PRTs on humanitarian access. On the whole, we don't, the conversations that take place around humanitarian access, to the degree that the PRTs have been involved, it's been more at the level of, look, if we need to reach a particular community or do something in an area where the PRT has influence, or has certainly military activities or other activities, then at least sharing that information. So, for example, that military action is suspended while that takes place, or so that the way the humanitarian actors move in or engage takes advantage of the knowledge of the PRTs in that area, and vice versa. I have to say, with the exception of a few PRTs, and there are some, many PRTs, it's the other way around. It's the PRTs who are coming to the humanitarian actors and to the UN for advice and information, because what tends to happen is that the turnover in PRTs is much more rapid than in the humanitarian community and the development community. So often the knowledge is more on that side. Don't really think of PRTs as major humanitarian actors, but they can be facilitators. They can be useful in making sure that humanitarian action is successful.
Any other questions? I wanted then, before we adjourn, I wanted to ask another question. It really is a follow-up to our discussion coming up from downstairs, is that you have the opportunity to travel all over the country and that you do that so frequently. And of course, here today we've talked a lot about engaging with the local community and the importance of that. Could you talk a little bit about the connections between Kabul and the provinces and what you've seen in cooperation, central government, local government? Thanks.
Okay, and actually, to our Japanese colleague, this is relevant as well. I mean, one of the functions of the PRTs, bizarrely, has been to link the provinces with Kabul, because sometimes the governors complain, rightly or wrongly, that Kabul isn't paying enough attention to their needs and concerns, and they often turn to the local PRT and sometimes to the UN to facilitate that discussion. Which should not be the case, of course. It should be, and this reveals an issue with which our Afghan partners are fully aware, which is in a way making the machinery of government more functional between Kabul and the provinces. things like important but boring things like subnational finance. How do you make sure that resources going to the state at the central level really are going down the tubes to the local, head of the line ministries at the provincial level responsible for health or education or refugees or disaster management. And, this speaks, again, I think we need to take a medium-term approach to this. We're only 10 or 11 years into the, as it were, since 9/11, since a totally new environment in Afghanistan, a very ambitious state-building project is in place. And inevitably, there are things that do not work, things that can be improved. And one of the things that clearly needs improvement is matching the responsibility that provincial governments have been given with real authority. And that needs to be partly a financial matter, but it's partly that they also need to have greater authority to shape provincial level and indeed district level priorities and development plans, have more capacity to get things done. And in a way, the race is on to strengthen that capacity before the international military leaves, before that results, as I hope it doesn't, but most people think it will, in a reduction of international support for Afghanistan. Can that capacity development challenge be met? The answer is it will not be met everywhere. And to the degree that it will be met, it will be because there are dynamic governors or dynamic line ministries or reformers trying to get things done. Where it won't be met is where the local system is either corrupt or been hijacked by other interests, or where security is so bad that focusing on things like service provision and fixing the justice system simply does not get the priority that otherwise it would deserve.
Well, really, thank you very much, Michael. I think this has been a great start of our humanitarian series, and certainly you've given us insights and your perspective both on the humanitarian situation and the broader situation and outlook. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your coming.
Thank you very much.